Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna take a look at some orchid species more for inspiration reasons. I wanted to do an update, but then I kind of changed my mind. We are just going to go through some orchid species that I find unique. So I'm gonna pull out all of the orchid species that I think are unique, I think are easy to care for actually. And funny enough, all of them are coming from the very same shelf here. So they get the very same care. Even though they don't all come from the very same location in their natural habitat, there is this golden line where everybody is okay under the same conditions. So all of these orchids, in my opinion, are easy to care for in home conditions as well. And they're just alternatives, let's say, to typical Dendrobiums, Cattleya's, and all of those really fun stuff, which are cool, but sometimes we feel the need to have something unique in our collection, right? Alrighty, so let's start. So let's start with the Rentas Grandiflora. Some of you might know it already. I have it for about a year or so, and behold, we are going to bloom really soon. But I wanted to film the bud before it opened. I'm gonna give you a close-up. Do you see how unique the shape is? If we think of Angraecums or Sriracha or Neophoenicias, the spur, which contains the nectar, is pretty thin usually. Not on this orchid. There's an entire chamber there. I find this really unique, and I can only imagine how pretty the flower will be. Bonus, this orchid is supposed to be fragrant. It's supposed to have a buttery fragrance, but in the good way. So again, very curious about that. And also she is a sequential bloomer, meaning that a flower spike will produce several flowers along its life, but I'm not entirely sure how long this flower spike will continue to bloom. This is the first time this orchid blooms. I don't see remains of other flower spikes. And also, you can see we have a keiki here. I was hoping this guy will bloom as well, but no, I don't see any flower spikes. The mother plant, on the other hand, has one big flower spike, a second tiny one, and a third super tiny one, which I've never seen before in pictures. Usually this orchid produces pretty long flower spikes, but I'm not going to complain. I find that the orchid herself looks pretty unique as well, but you can see that I switched it to organic media. I had leaf tip dieback in leca, and I just didn't want to wait around for it to get very bad. I acted and everything is okay. However, the orchid did not suffer at all, didn't have any issues with the repotting. The flower spikes continued to grow, the buds continued to develop, and the roots, as you can see, continued to grow. This is a very vigorous species, doesn't take tremendous amounts of light, doesn't really fuss about humidity or temperature. She kind of likes intermediate temperatures as far as I can see in my experience, so I don't think you should have much issues with it in home conditions really. One thing that will happen, and probably will scare you, it scared me as well, is that the flower spike will start to become brown and dry. It will be covered practically in these dried sheets. It's okay, it's normal, it's supposed to be that way. When it first starts, it's a beautiful green color, and then it starts to brown from the bottom to the top. And you will think that it started to rot, but it's not the case. Don't do anything, hang on to it. The top of the flower spike is always much greener, as you can see in all of these instances, but in time it will dry out. So keep this in mind and don't cut the flower spike when you see this happening. Just hang on to it. So I think it's gonna take a few more days for this orchid to bloom. Maybe we'll make a separate video. Anyway, I don't think we're gonna see it at the end of the month, but there we have it. The bud is just really beautiful. Next up, this is Oeceoclades spatulata. P.S. You'll have the names of all of these orchids down below in the description, so you can check them out, copy-paste if you want to Google them. This orchid is mainly grown for its foliage, and would you look at that? I'll give you some close-ups because this is something you want to see up close. The Oeceoclades is a terrestrial orchid. I grow it in a bark mixture actually, nothing with soils or anything, but the grade is pretty fine. I'm not using very chunky medium, and I have to say I have absolutely no issues with this orchid. She's been growing beautifully. As you can see, it produces pseudobulbs, which are very dark in color, almost black. In reality, they're a very dark purple, and the leaves, well, it's hard to describe the colors of the leaves. It's a very dark green with some silver and a little hint of pink in there. There's something truly unique. This orchid also blooms, but the bloom really is nothing much in comparison to the foliage. It will be absolutely fantastic to have a bloom from this orchid at some point, just because I'm curious. But I grow this one for the foliage, and whenever I show it in videos, many people ask what orchid is that it's just the focal point whenever I film it. Also, it is not a very big orchid, nor will it grow to be very big. Currently, she is the size of my palm, and as far as I know, it really doesn't grow much bigger than this. So you don't have to create a whole lot of space in your shelf for it. And again, I grow it in the same place, and I do grow it in the very same shelf that I grow the Aeranthes. I don't do anything special for it. It lives in my grow room and it doesn't really require anything special either. I fertilize it together with the other orchids, and ever since I purchased it, it has been growing this new growth, which is about to mature. And before it matures, can you see the pseudobulb is actually a really nice green color. After it matures, I'm assuming it will go dark, and the leaves are even more intense in color since they're so fresh. The pattern gives you the impression that they have some stripes, but to the touch there is actually no texture to it, or nothing that matches with what the pattern shows. The leaves are very sturdy, very rigid. They're not flimsy, they're not glossy, but definitely they don't have lines or striations on them or anything of the sorts. Overall, it is such a beautiful orchid to have foliage-wise, and when it will bloom, definitely we're gonna take a look at it. But if you're interested in this orchid, I suggest you don't get your hopes high regarding flowers. Just enjoy the beautiful foliage. Next up, we can't talk about unique species without mentioning the Dendrobium cucumerinum. Currently, he's been reclassified to something else. He has a genus of its own. You'll have more details in the description. And as the name suggests, it looks like a cucumber. This is the leaf actually, and the pseudobulb is a very, very tiny formation at the base here. So the leaf is actually what gives it its name and has this really bumpy, very succulent structure. Now, this orchid also produces flowers. All or most orchids produce flowers, but again, it is grown and coveted for its foliage, not its blooms. If you check the Orchid Species website, you will see how the blooms look like. Nothing to write home about really in comparison to other orchids. And also the internet suggests that they don't smell very good either. So I'm curious, from this point of view, I just want to know what the whole deal is about. But when I purchased this orchid, I just wanted to have it due to the shape of its leaves, not the flowers. Just like the other two, I find this orchid to be very, very easy to grow. It produces roots readily. I recently repotted this orchid. I do believe it is better in a rather shallow and wide pot or mounted if you're okay with watering so often. Of course, if you have an automated system, go for mounted since you're not going to be wasting your time watering, but definitely it is suitable for pots as well, and it has this really nice pattern of growth. It will pose some difficulty when it's going to spill out of the pot, so if you can train it to grow towards the center by rotating it so that the light dictates the direction of growth, that would be great. That's what I'm trying to do with mine. It's not working all that well, as you can see, but I did manage to make it turn around a little bit more. Hopefully, fingers crossed, I will make it grow towards the center of the pot. Next up, this is the Ceratostylis rubra. Now this orchid species, I have to say, I consider it to be very, very underrated. There aren't many people who are really in love with this orchid, but I have to say I am. Flower-wise, it might not be the most spectacular thing in the world. I will share with you a picture from when mine was in bloom for the first time. It was the first blooming, so things will only get better. But if you can imagine that really pretty orange flower everywhere on the plant as it grows, and if you can imagine this plant will continue to bush up and pretty much become like a sort of pumped up Neophonetia in the end, I think the display will be absolutely fantastic. I already really love the pattern of growth of this orchid. As you can see, we're growing upwards, but also we're bushing out. It reminds me a lot of the Neophonetia, but in my opinion, it is a faster grower than the Neo, and it is much easier to care for. With the Neophonetia, you have to be careful in the winter time, have to be careful with the watering. I personally couldn't bloom the Neo just yet, I'm working on it, but this one was just a breeze to bloom. The only downside with this orchid is the root system. As you can see here, the roots are the fuzziest, most brittle little things ever. They're cute, they're wonderful, but they're just so incredibly fragile. So whenever you will repot this orchid, removing the medium, no matter what type of medium you're using, will be a nightmare. and that is that. So I suggest that you repot this orchid when the weather is warmer, in the springtime, beginning of summer, when she's in active growth. The fact that she is a very vigorous plant will help you a lot, but yeah, the root system is its downfall. Other than that though, she's just wonderful and looks so pretty on the shelf, and I can only imagine when she will be in bloom, that multitude of orange flowers, it will be so incredibly beautiful. Next up, here is something for the Phalaenopsis lovers. Even though she's not entirely a Phalaenopsis, this is the Doritis pulcherrima, and I do believe they have been reclassified as Phalaenopsis at some point. I think the classification was reverted, not entirely sure. You know how I stand on reclassifications. I don't care because it's a whole mess. So on my channel, I am going to call this a Doritis. Now, this species of orchids are mainly terrestrial. Even though they look like a Phalaenopsis and even the flowers look like Phalaenopsis, the way they grow their spikes is different. The spike grows upright, it will not arch unless it is a hybrid with a Phalaenopsis. Otherwise, it will stay upright, it will tend to be rather long, and the flowers are typically tiny on these orchids. Now, this orchid is very similar care-wise to Phalaenopsis orchids, hence why I believe it's a beginner orchid as well. And the fact that the flower spikes tend to grow upwards just makes it a little bit easier to train them, to manage them. They will not start to grow towards the window and eventually hit the window and have all sorts of issues with the buds, which might get damaged because the window might be hot or might be cold, and so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying? I find this to be a little bit more comfortable to have and to own on a shelf. And as far as care goes, it really isn't much different than any Phalaenopsis. Root-wise, very similar to Phalaenopsis as well. There isn't much to say, but I did wanted to mention it just in case you weren't aware that they exist. If you're good with Phalaenopsis, you can try this one out. There is a peloric version, which I'm after as well, which is gorgeous. There's also a sort of purple-blue variety as well. There is a bit of variety within this group of orchids, so do keep them in mind if you think the flowers are pretty. The orchid is easy to grow. Next up, we have an Angraecum. This is the Angraecum leonis, and the name might be derived from the way the flowers look like, but I have to say I find it very appropriate for the way the entire orchid looks like. Don't you just see the hair of a lion? I'm not entirely sure how to call that beautiful neck hair they have. I'm sorry, my vocabulary is lacking in the animal department, but I hope you get what I mean. I find this orchid to be so showy. Now, this is not a big orchid. It's supposed to be a rather miniature Angraecum, but there are two versions or two varieties of the leonis. One that apparently is smaller than mine, and mine, which is the bigger of the two. So you can imagine that it will not grow to the size of the Vici or Sesquipedale or anything of the sorts, making it really suited for tinier spaces. This orchid not only looks beautiful, but also has really nice and very fragrant, they say, flowers. It has never bloomed for me because I purchased it as a very young plant. It's not gonna take long until she blooms. I think she has all the conditions necessary to bloom. You can see that the leaves grew bigger and bigger, so the orchid is doing great. Root-wise, she's doing pretty great as well. You can see reproduction is not shabby. And this is one orchid, one Angraecum with pretty thin roots. Generally, Angraecums have pretty thick roots, as we're gonna see the last orchid of today. This one, on the other hand, just looks different than all of the other Angraecums which I have come across. Reason why I purchased it, I found it unique, and even if the orchid is not in bloom, I absolutely adore the foliage, the way it looks like, the lion attitude of it, maybe. I might just have a wild imagination. I definitely recommend it even for home conditions as well. It doesn't strike me as a finicky orchid quite at all. And trust me, I do have finicky orchids here in the grow room as well, and they behave very differently than these orchids. And last orchid species we're gonna take a look at today, another Angraecum, can you believe it? This is the Magdalene. I think this was the first Angraecum I ever had, or the second. I don't remember which came first, the Sesquipedale or this one. This is not the same one I had many years ago. I sadly lost that one, I think, when we moved here. This is a different one that I purchased, I think, a year ago or so, and look at it, it's growing so well. I discovered I really like sturdy leaves, ones that seem to be different than your typical glossy light green leaves, and I adore the leaves of this particular orchid. As it grows, things will only get better and better. You can see that the leaves are growing bigger and bigger. It's still a very young orchid, and I'm not sure if it's gonna bloom this year, if it's capable to bloom this year. Next year maybe, but it's a miniature Angraecum, which again has white fragrant flowers, and it just holds a special place in my heart. But I think the foliage would be appealing for a great number of people, not just me. It's not just because I have nice memories regarding this orchid. I do believe it's an appealing orchid, nevertheless, even without the flowers. Root-wise, as I was saying, this is a much thicker rooted orchid. Most Angraecums don't have thin roots. That's why the Leonis really looks a little different than all of the other Angraecums that I have. And I do actually have quite a few Angraecums. I have a video about them, about my collection. Check it down below if you're interested. There's something about these orchids that I really like, even though I have to say I didn't see many in bloom. But it's okay, time is not lost. I really enjoyed them, foliage-wise as well. I really love growing them. And again, all of these orchids that I showed you, they come from the very same shelf, very same light, very same temperature, and all of the rest. And that has been it for today. As you can see, two of the orchids we looked at today, they reside one next to each other, and that's how I keep them pretty much all the time, not just for this video. So I hope you drew some inspiration from the orchids you saw today, and you know the drill, like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. And if you'd like to support the channel, do consider visiting the merch store. We have some limited edition stuff. It's gonna end on the 21st of July. I know there is no countdown, but I will remind you, some settings on Teespring just don't work, and that is that. But anyway, with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!